Welcome to Building Astropad. I'm Matt Runge, co-founder and CEO at Astropad, and I'll be taking you behind the scenes at our company where we build software and hardware products for creative people. So if you're a creator interested in starting a business or creating your next big project, join us and let's learn together. Okay, hi everyone, Matt here, and today I am with two members of our engineering team. And we're going to be talking about porting Liquid to Windows. And Liquid is the underlying tech that powers both Astropad Studio, Astropad Standard, and Luna Display. And our journey in taking a very Mac and iOS specific code base and bringing it to Windows. And so with me, I have Jeremy Knope. You say hi, Jeremy.
Hello.
And Corwin Durkach. Corwin, if you could say hi.
Hi.
Yeah, so good to have you guys here. First, I should really set the stage for what we're talking about, why we're doing all this. So for the past, it hasn't been quite a year and a half yet, but it's quite over a year now, a year and a couple months. We've been working on porting our apps to Windows. Previously, we've been Mac only, Mac plus the iPad, and we've had to port over to Windows, which if you want the whole backstory on that, I would recommend checking out our first episode where we talk about sherlocked by Apple, and that kind of sets the stage for why we're going to Windows. Even though for a long time we've wanted to go to Windows, being sherlocked by Apple really forced us to go to Windows on a tight timetable. So all of our apps run on Liquid, and Liquid is this custom network protocol and video streaming system we've built over many years, and it's got a lot of Objective-C in it. And we needed to get that to run on Windows. And so Corwin and Jeremy have been working on this a ton the past year and have made some major milestones in getting us over to Windows, but we're not using Objective-C. So we should probably start there. So Jeremy, do you want to start for us? Because you're really how Rust came into this picture. How did it all start? Yeah, can you tell us how it all started?
Well, I knew some people online that talked about Rust a bunch, so I started to kind of get a little bit of interest in it, maybe few years ago or so, and curious about it due to its kind of unique feature set. And at some point, started actually learning it and finding time to learn it and started to really enjoy it. And the big thing is kind of like the unique feature set is that Rust is aiming to be like fast and safe and also empower those two things while being able to do like concurrency and things like that. So yeah, that was hugely attractive that, I can write, this kind of high level code that I'm used to writing, but it is really fast and reliable application, which is awesome.
And it's got really good cross-platform support, which was key for us too.
Yep. Yeah, like one option could have been Swift if Swift, I think, was more mature on Windows because, Swift is basically Apple's language of choice, or at least they try to encourage you, on Mac and iOS. But, like Windows, they're starting to really push towards it, so it's getting there. But at least at the time we were kind of looking, it's like, doesn't feel quite ready yet.
Yeah, and it's still early, and you have to question how much commitment Apple has to long-term too, because obviously their first allegiance is to their own platforms. So, are they going to maintain these other platforms long-term? That's especially for a new code base, it's a big bet to make.
Yeah, it might rely on the open source community around Swift more than Apple themselves. And personally, I'm not sure what that looks like currently. But I know with Rust, they have actually a very nice tier system of what they very much support completely, a little less support, and it goes down from there. But the Mac, iOS, and Windows and Linux are kind of tier one. We definitely support these.
Yeah. So what did you think, Corwin, when we because there was a couple other things we looked at as well for porting, and then Rust as well. I mean, what was your thoughts on the whole thing?
Well, the first time I heard of Rust actually was right before I joined you guys, and I was looking up things about the other team members, and I noticed on Jeremy's GitHub before I even met him that he had a Rust project. I was like, what is Rust?
What is Rust? Yeah.
Kind of peeked at it and was like, okay, that's kind of interesting. And then, fast forward to now where we decided to go with it, and right away after I started playing around with it, it was just super exciting because I'm the type of person that doesn't change horses very quickly.
Okay.
Like I was doing Objective C and Swift and iOS for like 10 years, right? And some people are really good at like hopping and trying out different languages, and I'm just not quick at that. But when I started playing with Rust, it just started to be so clear that they were solving these old programming problems that just, of like thread safety, memory management, and it was so much harder to shoot yourself in the foot. And that was really exciting. And at the same time, it was a good challenge to learn a new language where their borrow checker and their compiler is so thorough and friendly. And so it was fun. It was just a pleasure to learn, but also a good challenge. Like the learning curve I found pretty steep.
Oh yeah, still, and I've done so little Rust. I mean, you two now are very well versed in Rust after all the many lines of code you've written. But yeah, I definitely feel you on the learning curve. Like I'm still trying to poke and prod around. Like I really need to build a real project at some point in it to get a handle on it.
That's such another good point about why Rust is so agile, is because you can, like just what I was working on this week, you can just start from scratch and you can have like a multi-threaded test system, in like minutes. It's,
Yeah.
And then you go back and you look at some of our Objective-C code, and whether you're using Grand Central Dispatch or not, and you're just like, man, it is just so much more work to do this in another language, and so less safe.
Yeah, and definitely see that with a big chunk of our compression code is still in C, C++. And sometimes we run into some errors in there, and we're like, "Well, this wouldn't happen if it was in Rust." Some of the memory errors.
Yeah, like you just have
hint,
to worry.
Hint, we need to write it in Rust.
Like the race conditions too, right? That's such a subtle, nuanced problem, and it's pretty hard to get in that corner in Rust. You still can, but it's way harder, and it's just so, I don't know, it's just more comfortable.
Yeah, it definitely helps you, kind of like guides you away from some really common pitfalls, or just flat out prevents you, which is really nice. And I think one of my, especially coming from Objective-C more than Swift, since our code base is all Objective-C, we don't have like the issue of runtime failures or runtime crashes as much. I mean, they're not non-existent in Rust, but it's very unlikely because if it compiles, it's a lot more correct on the Rust side. So that's really nice to be able to run this and have a little more confidence that it's not going to blow up because you mistyped something like an Objective-C, which is a warning or maybe nothing when it builds.
Yeah, it's really nice feeling too that we have all of this new code. And in a little bit, we should get into like our overall strategy and what we have done so far with it. But all this new code that's in Rust and we know is much safer. It's much more, I guess, robust, I would describe. And so when there are like crazy crashers, I'm like thinking like, oh, it's probably the encoder that's got C++ in it, And we did look at a couple other strategies too for porting before Rust. I know we looked at doing Objective-C on Windows, but that was super sketchy. It just wasn't well supported. Things like, we're using Grand Central Dispatch and libdispatch, like you mentioned, Corwin, heavily on the Objective-C side, and like that's not available on Windows. How would you port it? It was pretty gnarly. We looked at using GNU Step to port some things over as well, and it was just a mess. And then the other thing was, okay, well, let's port everything to C++. That's portable. But nobody was excited about that. Like seriously. And the only reason that the encoder or the compression stuff has so much C++ in it right now is because so much of it was already C. So on many files, we could practically just change the file extension and get it to compile with C++. It wasn't a big deal there. There was less Objective-C. So then when Rust came into the picture, I think it was Jeremy, you brought Rust in. You're like, what if we use Rust? It was like, oh, maybe this is the ticket. This is the horse we're going to bet on to do this rewrite.
Yeah, one of the things I thought of lately was the addition by subtraction, which was we're going to have this solid code base, but then be able to use it in the future. So less of the previous sort of like unsafe and newer code, less newer code, but it's safer. And then, moving forward, we can roll it back into other products. Yeah, it just felt like a no-brainer once it was presented.
I think another one of the kind of big things that made the choice a little easier with Rust 2 is the fact that it's a lot more compatible with existing languages.
Oh yeah, that's a great point too. Yeah.
Yeah, the fact that it can call into C code or be called from C code with a little extra work basically is very appealing, especially okay, now we can suddenly call it from Objective-C and we can call it from say C# or C++ on Windows. We can now share this but not require the entire app to be Rust, because that's also its own kind of issue. Once you hit to the GUI, you start to have to make some different choices.
Yeah, that's a good point. How are we doing it right now? How are we doing the GUI and the UI layer? How are we interfacing with Rust?
Yeah, so currently what we ended up choosing was using kind of the native environment of Windows, and therefore similar to Mac, where we're going to have the native Mac, but we may use Rust as well. So yeah, it's kind of like we take the core of our application, Liquid, really, and that's what's being pushed into Rust or being ported into Rust. And that's kind of you could think of it as the engine of our applications. And so the engine, is kind of nice and separate and basically running itself with kind of a minimal interface to the actual GUI. So that way, we kind of minimize the back and forth and complications that do exist, even though Rust is compatible with say C-based languages or C-friendly languages, there are limitations and complications. So, we try to keep it minimal so that, hey, our interface doesn't need to do a whole lot, say on Windows. So we just kind of give it the minimal set of all right, this is how you start things up. This is what you'll, tell you what's going on. And then, so that kind of bridges over to the C#, and then the UI reacts to it, and the UI will tell, the engine what's going on, what the user's doing. Oh, the user moved the selection, things like that. So that's working out fairly well.
So right now we don't have any UI that's directly using Rust, right? You were going to add something, Karan?
Yeah, well, we've played around with it in the past, and isn't some of our kind of internal testing stuff using some Rust UI?
Yeah, exactly. That we have explored some as kind of quick to build internal tools. Oh, hey, I need to build this tool real quick. What can I use in Rust so I don't have to go through the process of bridging and all that stuff? Because it's not overly complicated. It's extra work. And yeah, we've explored we've used two things internally. One is kind of a young framework called Iced, and then the other one is actually Windows only native Windows GUI from one of our other engineers.
Yeah, Gabriel, who's on our team.
Yeah.
He made it.
So,
Yeah, so that's been super cool. Have we had any issues with the bridging? Have we had any performance issues, or just been too clunky? I know that's commonly an issue when bridging between languages.
I feel like for me, I've just been a utilizer of it. I haven't, because Jeremy did most of the actual bridging code. But for me, it's more a maintenance thing, it feels like. So it's kind of just more to keep track of. And it's oh, well, we've got to alter the FFI to change that or something. So it's kind of an extra step all the time, but it's necessary. I mean, but as far as things getting mangled and stuff like that, that's all pretty automated because Jeremy, is really good at setting that all up.
Yeah, it's not without its kind of pitfalls and warts, because you're taking kind of this language that's got all these nice features and having to kind of start pushing some of that stuff across this border, basically this FFI border, which is the border between Rust and say C. And that has its kind of pitfalls that we have to kind of deal with. It can be a little clunky because you have to do a lot more work that would be a one-line thing in Rust. But yeah, but like Oren said, it is necessary. And it's still just managing to keep that minimal, especially with kind of the way our app works, has proven that it's It's not too bad, and there shouldn't be really high costs either with how we're using it either.
Yeah, I feel like we read a bit about that, and we kept coming across things that saying there was like essentially zero cost to go across the foreign function interface border, so FFI border. Yeah, I don't remember there being big hiccups around it. Or
Yeah, I think you mostly have to. My understanding is, you have to look out for this with, I think, the more managed languages. So like if we were doing more high performance code across our FFI, you know, C#, there may be some costs going across. And more so if we say someday we start looking at like Android, we have to be a lot more
Java.
careful with
Yeah,
that.
the JVM. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, and in our case, we're really going from Rust over to C, and we're seeing like really great performance there with that. So for us, we've really got this core, this Rust core, that's our liquid engine. And then on top of that, we've got bindings to, the native, whatever's the native UI toolkits and kind of native language on that platform, C# on Windows, Objective-C on iOS and Mac. And do you guys have any idea what the code breakdown is now in terms of how much of our code base now is Rust versus other languages now?
Yeah, I was just looking. It's real rough, but there's a little bit more Rust than C/C++, I believe.
Okay. For a code base that's had a lot of C and C++, that's a lot.
Yeah. It's like, somewhere in the 20s to 30,000 lines of Rust and like 20 something thousand maybe of C. It's a real rough guess because, sometimes you have a lot of code that's not even in use in your code base that you might be counting.
Right. But still, it's been a lot of Rust. It's been a lot of Rust that's been put in there to get at this spot. And we're not totally done with the port to Windows, but we really, at this point, I would say, have our liquid engine in a really good spot where we're getting really good performance out of it. We're seeing really similar performance to the Mac side of things, which, and of course on the Mac too, we're at some point going to rip that out and replace that with the Rust engine as well. Right now, we're only using it on the Windows side, but we will switch that around as well. So over this whole experience, I mean, what do you guys think has been the toughest part of porting to Windows?
I can answer first. If you want to.
Yeah. Go for it, Corwin. Yeah.
So for me, I hadn't done Windows specific programming in a long time. One of the first things I dove into was building the capture part in Rust. And so that immediately got me into the DXGI arena and the FFI arena with, all kinds of unsafe, complicated calls and things like that. And I think it was a great challenge, but I would say that it was pretty tough. Like for a few reasons, I hadn't really done Windows programming before. I didn't know anything about DXGI and hadn't really used a lot of FFI stuff before. So it was sort of three complicated things all at once, but still totally worth it.
Yeah.
Because you get into nitty gritty stuff like with the Windows documentation, there'll be a remark section, and that section just has like gold nuggets in it sometimes. Or you'll hit up a wall with, you're just trying to make a call happen through that Win API interface, but you forgot to initiate some struct that is accessed by a double pointer somehow, and then it just blows up, right? So you spend like hours trying to figure it out. So for me, it was those kinds of things that I would get hung up on. And you learn them just like you learn in any other language, but it felt tough at the time.
Yeah, and I mean, at least for me, like I'm coming from the Mac side of things, right? So I'm
me too.
APIs. Yeah, all three of us are actually, and so like the DXGI, which is the DirectX, where the screen capture stuff for DirectX is in there, and it's just like gnarly to try to read that. And then so you're dealing with Rust, trying to figure out Rust, and trying to figure out this new API that we've never seen before to capture the screen.
Yeah, and that was about a year ago. It was last August. So yeah, it was.
Oh, wow.
I was pretty new into Rust.
It feels like just yesterday.
Yeah. Yeah. So, what do you think, Jeremy?
Yeah, I think some of the harder parts are definitely kind of learning like the native APIs, because despite the fact that we're using Rust, we often have to call into, the native APIs, which are C for the most part. A lot of the stuff on Windows can be accessed at the C level, And those they can range from not too bad to pretty obtuse. And yeah, so there's some headbanging fun times when dealing with some of basically the older style APIs in Windows. Say learning, some of the GUI stuff with C#, that's a lot easier to understand and follow. But some of the almost more legacy kind of area, or at least older style APIs with the C level can be pretty confusing, especially like DirectX, that's very complicated.
Yeah. And some of the Win32 stuff.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
pretty gnarly. What do you feel like's been, I don't know, surprised you on Windows or been better on Windows? Which I can go first here. It's been a long time since I've done serious work on Windows. And so I was pleasantly surprised by the development tools. We've been using Windows Terminal, been using Visual Studio Code, and just the Rust compiler and everything else that goes with it. Now, granted, I haven't been doing heavy coding, just kind of dabbling here and there in things, getting my nose in the way maybe, but it's been surprisingly painless for me, somebody that's like really used to living in Xcode, to go over and start to use like Visual Studio Code and the Windows Terminal. And I was like, actually, I kind of like these tools. Like now I've got Visual Studio Code on my Mac too. So
yeah, I would say Visual Studio Code's been pretty great. Despite kind of the immaturity of some of the tool chain, more like the IDE kind of tools for Rust, it's still been pretty great. I would say though, Visual Studio itself, I haven't been as thrilled with, but part of that might just be like using Visual Studio Code so much. When I open up Visual Studio, it's a little too different and sometimes not obvious how to get things done. But there's been some definitely some nice things on Windows. I agree with the terminal as well. I like the new terminal. I've gone crazy and customized mine quite a bit. But also, I like the fact that we have, like, getting more to the liquid side of things, is that we have the ability to do a lot more with the input on Windows, because unlike Mac,
that's a good point. Yeah, I've forgotten about that.
yeah, exactly. We have the ability to do touch on Windows, like officially. Like Mac isn't a touchscreen OS.
Right. So there's no APIs for it.
Yeah, where Windows is like, hey, this is actually a first-party concept. And so we can actually look into embracing that, like, with our apps. No promises, when, but that's a very appealing thing to be able to, like, oh, we can actually use this instead of like, oh, this is a mouse, hey, you're using your finger,
Well, and on the Mac, we pretend to be a touchpad, like on the laptop. That's how we do scrolling and things, because on the Mac, there's no native concept of these touch interactions.
But yeah,
forgotten about that.
Yeah, it's definitely nice where, like, oh, we could do like tiny little things like on Windows. If you're using a touchscreen Windows machine, you can scroll things just like you do on the iPad. So, a single finger, it's a lot more intuitive because you have your iPad in your lap. You might default to using it like an iPad, and on the Mac, you can't quite do that, because, hey, you intend to draw it with your finger and not necessarily scroll.
Yeah. What do you think, Corwin?
Yeah, I didn't think of the Visual Studio Code until you guys mentioned it, but that's our daily tool now, and it's really good. Just seeing the amount of third-party extensions you can put in. I mean, we use, of course, Rust Analyzer a lot, but all the other ones, like all the code, like the To-Do extension, anything you could think of, it's there.
Ooh, I don't have the To-Do extension.
Yeah, like it's all there. It's really cool. And I even use it just to take notes now, right? Like I just need to jot something down. It's just, so I'm glad you guys mentioned that, because yeah, it's pretty solid. Even though it is a little young and it's not as mature as some larger IDEs, that means it's a little bit lighter on its feet, so it can update faster. And their updates come pretty fast. The other thing on Windows so far that we just recently discovered was support as devs. We ran into a few issues where we reached out.
That's a great one too. Yeah. This is weird for us coming from the Apple side of things.
Yeah. So from the Apple side, I had pretty good experiences in the past with Apple, but it always felt like, it's this walled garden, right? You're like, you send off your question, and even with a high level technical support, it was always very like robotic and arm's length, and unless you were at a WWDC lab or something. But through their dev system, it was very like, it was never a great option. And just recently we reached out through, is it Yammer?
Yeah, they do use Yammer for
Yeah.
Yeah, it's
for
like a
development.
limited access thing, or even like just the people that have reached out to try to like help us, like in general. Like there's been some kind of relations type people that seemed a lot more welcoming.
Yeah, so they were so fast to respond to our pretty specific technical questions, and it kind of felt more like a colleague was leaning over and working with you. And they were like, seemed genuinely excited to try and help us. And that's a very different feel than the Apple world. And, again, that's all I've lived and breathed for 10, 15 years. So it's interesting. It's interesting. Even though the Microsoft or Windows world is a bit more Wild West, it's got its advantages like that, I think.
Yeah, it's definitely been the case. Yeah. And I agree, coming from the Apple world where it's really hard to get a response out of Apple, it's really hard often to get an answer to something. Or, they don't want to tell you something because of the secrecy, kind of like how open Microsoft has been, how willing to help, and quickly too, like within 24 hours.
Yeah, it was
have an answer on stuff. It's
and
crazy.
it was more than one person too. I think a couple of our questions, we had at least two people kind of chime in. And what was cool about it too is they actually shared stories about like other developers in similar situations. And they pointed to like something that, was it Firefox had an issue or something like that?
Oh, it was Chrome.
Chrome, yeah.
Oh, Chrome.
Yeah, it was involving Chrome and high precision timing. Chrome used a lot of battery due to leaving high precision timing constantly running.
Yeah. So it's just neat that they, they're not. And the guy even said, like, Windows is not a real-time operating system. He just like call it what it is, right? So we don't have that kind of access all the time. I don't feel like there was that level of self-awareness on the other side.
No, definitely not. And that's been really, really refreshing and very, especially right now with what's going on in the development community too on the Apple side, where a lot of people are complaining, especially about how Apple's treating developers. The app review process, the battle with Epic, giving developers basically no heads up on the iOS 14 release. So there's been a lot kind of brewing. So it's really interesting to compare that with our experience right now working with Microsoft. And it's not like we're some big name, like huge developer that everybody knows. No, we're a tiny little place, but yet they're willing to help out. So it's pretty cool. Pretty cool.
I'd almost be curious, like if we have the option, like we could, choose to go, like say in the Microsoft Store, which should have some parallels to Apple. They have a review process and stuff. So I'd be very curious to compare that if we end up doing so, because that's such a sore subject, I feel like, on the Apple side, that I'm like, all right, I'm kind of curious.
Let's just try it.
Kind of expecting Microsoft to be a little more friendly on that, because I know they got their own, rules and stuff. So
yeah,
we'll see.
If they're treating most developers like this is really smart on Microsoft's part to kind of play the alter ego to Apple, right?
Yeah, we'll see if we get any super cryptic, not approved.
Yeah.
And we can put our hands up in the air after.
Yep. Well, because all of us are like longtime Mac, iOS people. Like, what's it been like working on Windows so much?
There's definitely things I miss, because there are things I like about Windows, but overall, I do feel like it's kind of like there's some sloppiness to it. There's inconsistencies and just, headaches. Like, you're more likely to have to fight with drivers and stuff on Windows than like, on a Mac, because everything's just, pre-built basically. You don't have any choice. Or things like, some settings in Windows are kind of like hidden away in some more legacy UI. But some settings are in kind of the more modern UI, things like that kind of bug me a little bit, but they're a little minor. Or actually, one of my big things is I miss having a very reliable drag and drop. Like on Mac, you can drag and drop like so many different things and so many apps support it. On Windows, it's pretty hit and miss. So like for example, I'm using the built-in VM Hyper-V manager on Windows, which is really cool that exists. That's pretty awesome. There's, very basic a virtual machine built in. But there's a weird thing where if you want to like bring a file into the VM, I'm used to like, you can just drag it in like VMware on a Mac. You can't drag it, but you can copy and paste it, like similar concept in my mind, but it just doesn't support it. There's little things like that that bug me, but there are some nice things too.
What do you think, Corwin?
Yeah, I feel the same way. It still feels like when I first set up Windows last year to start development on it, one of the first things that surprised me was installing Windows and how it still felt really clumsy, and it still was like nothing's changed since 1996. Like, how is this possible? They have a little bit, and they've got the newer UI happening, but it doesn't. I agree. It just feels a bit sloppy and clunky compared to the Mac OS is just so polished and reliable. So for me, I kind of keep one foot in each pond right now. If I can, and especially because of Rust being cross-platform, a lot of the time I'll just work on my Mac, and then when I need to, I'll move to Windows if I have to use Win API and stuff for testing. So I'll hop back and forth, or like right now I'm doing that quite a bit. So I use Synergy or Share Mouse to have mouse and keyboard to be able to control both. So that helps too, but I don't even try to drag and drop stuff on Windows because and I didn't realize why, but maybe that's like because I didn't realize it wasn't as
Yeah, it didn't.
pervasive.
It didn't.
Yeah, I mean, it works on some common apps like Slack. Slack does support it, so I do that plenty for screenshots and stuff.
So I feel like I'm probably still primarily a Mac user, but I kind of like where Microsoft is going at the moment. Like overall.
I agree. There's some really interesting stuff they're doing.
Yeah.
I like all the open source projects and contributions they've doing, like especially just because it's like, oh wow, this is like a new Microsoft, because in their past very much proprietary, closed source, etc. And now they have Visual Studio Codes, their open source project. The new terminal app is an open source project. They just are starting to contribute to like the Linux kernel for something I can't remember. Like it's nice to see them embracing like open source a little more.
Aren't they doing some like Rust promotion and Rust usage too? I feel like we've talked about this.
Oh yeah, they're starting to use it, I believe, internally, or maybe even in Windows.
Yeah, there's that. Was it WinRT? I think that they're adding a Rust.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there is. WinRT, like Rust. They call it a very specific name. They called like projection or something like that. Forget the term they use. Because like basically WinRT, there's like a C++ projection. I might be using the wrong word, but so yeah, you can access like this entire like basically the user interface kind of APIs for the most part from different languages other than C#, and now they've done one that is exposing that to Rust, which is pretty cool and promising for us even.
Yeah, definitely. It's good to see them picking that up as well. What other advice would you have for somebody else that's wants to adventure out on a project like this, that wants to make a cross-platform app? What would you suggest?
I mean, I feel like it's always important, like, because there's a lot of like arguing in the tech field of like, the best language or the best SDK tool, etc. But it really does come down to the right tool for the job. So for example, I would say like Rust is a very good choice for a lot of things, especially if you want some of that kind of high level, like stable and fast. Like if you're, because like maybe writing something in like say Electron and JavaScript and stuff might suit, the project you're working on. But hey, maybe you need to make something more performant. You could still use that and maybe start adding Rust in too. There's a lot of options, and it's really coming down to take a really good look at kind of the strengths and weaknesses of what you might think are some good choices. And yeah, Rust has got a lot of strengths in my opinion, so it's basically going to be my go-to language for like most things, especially command line tools. It's particularly nice for those.
Yeah, I totally agree with the right tool for the job. I think whenever you're trying to approach a new system or solve a new problem, you have to look at the the shortcomings that you've got and like critically analyze those. And so for us, I think it was cross-platform was the biggest, right? And so moving forward, it was Rust just seems like the safest one for that kind of approach for, lower latency, speed, safety, those, the trifecta of those things.
Do you think it would work for somebody that has a richer iPhone and iPad app, say? That, because a lot of our apps themselves don't have a ton of UI in them. They do a lot of mirroring. We mirror the desktop, either the Windows desktop or the Mac desktop onto the iPad. But there's not a ton of native UI itself. What do you think about if someone was doing a cross-platform app, they want to do Android, Windows, iOS?
Yeah, that feels like a different problem almost, like it's different worlds. Like if you want a polished iOS, iPad OS app, you can try and use, what is it, Reactive or some of the
React Native
the
is
canned
one of
ones.
Yeah.
But unless you've got like a really small templated problem, if you're not going to do, if it's not too complex, you can probably do it with one of those. But otherwise, I feel like if you want a real rich experience, you've got to go native for that level. Maybe underneath it would make sense, kind of like what we're doing, where lower down you've got cross-platform stuff. Maybe it's wherever it is. But at the high level there, I feel like you've got to be in the native land and the native language to make it as smooth and rich as possible. I don't know. What do you think, Jeremy?
Yeah, I've always been kind of a proponent of using the native kind of interface. And this is probably a little leftover, kind of like almost like the Mac snobbiness.
Totally.
Because you could say, like, I would almost describe like the older generation of software on the Mac was very much snobby, and like I would almost say, like, looking back at it, I would feel like it might have been unwelcoming for new people.
Oh yeah,
Because
probably.
hey, your app's not Mac-like enough.
Right.
So I carry some of that. Trying to remember that. It's like not everybody has the same kind of requirements or abilities to deliver something. Especially you have a small company or team, and you need to, like, in a hard requirement is like, hey, this needs to be on Android and iOS and maybe more. Yeah, you might be want to giving a strong look at something like React Native or Flutter, or there's a bunch of like the kind of the cross-platform UI SDKs. I do feel like they are a compromise in a lot of cases. So it depends on how much of that platform you want to be able to harness, because sometimes there may be something you don't have access to or can't quite do it the same, or things like that.
Yeah, I haven't worked with Electron a ton, and I don't, it's not going to work for mobile, really. You need to do something different on Android and iPhone and the iPad too. But for desktop apps, I would be interested to play around more with Electron and see, can you use a combination of web tech, maybe Rust in the core, and native APIs, and kind of use each of them for what they're best at. So maybe you have an app that does a lot of like document type layout and you want it to be cross platform. Well, a web engine could be really good to use for that because it's really powerful at that. And then if there's integration points where you tie in with the native APIs to make it really smooth, you kind of smooth out some of the rough edges, and then use Rust for any internal engines you need, like larger pieces of code. I'd be curious to play around with that. Now, granted, I haven't done any of this, but I'd be curious for a cross-platform app what that would look like, because it is difficult to build a cross-platform app that's going to work on Android, iOS, Mac, Windows as a small team. Not only is that a lot of APIs, but a lot of them are changing quickly. Like Apple's changing stuff very quickly. Now, there's Catalyst, there's other Swift UI. There's a lot of changes going on that it's almost a full-time job just to keep up with changes within one ecosystem, let alone maintain it across a bunch of different platforms.
Yeah, I would say there's a lot of interesting things going on with Rust, kind of in what you described. It seems to be a popular choice for speeding up something that needs to be sped up in a language that's slower. Like, oh, and this is how you can speed up a chunk of your Python by, like, oh, move this kind of a sensitive code into Rust and call Python calls into the Rust. I'm very intrigued by WebAssembly. Rust is one of the, I think, primary languages that targets WebAssembly. And I bet you that would be probably pretty useful in conjunction with Electron.
Yeah, I'm pretty intrigued by that as well.
Yeah, so there's some interesting stuff you could do there, you know.
Which it's weird to hear these words coming out of my mouth as a very, very long time Mac developer,
Yep.
but nevertheless, stuff to think about now these days. So this has been a long project. It's been a tough project for us. And granted, we're still not at the end of it, but we've made huge, huge milestones and huge breakthroughs in bringing Liquid to Windows. It hasn't always been rainbows and butterflies, that's for sure. And
Yep.
I was curious, what do you do when things get tough?
Yeah, I feel like I was thinking about this today, and I was like, what do we do? There's sort of two or three things. One of the things I like that we do as a team is we can switch sort of the owners of the code a bit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So if
I was
it's
gonna
like
bring
if
that
I'm
up, too.
if I'm burning out on something, sort of like, oh man, like I know there's some bugs here, or this API is just beating me down, and then I feel like, just really fortunate to be part of a team where people will happily kind of like, sure, I'll take a look, or even before that step, if they're not going to maybe take over part of the ownership, like you can drop a question in Slack and you'll at least get one response. You might even get 5 from other engineers, and I just feel like there's a really solid support system there between all of us. Like nobody's afraid to say like, I don't know what's going on here, right? And for me, that's what keeps it driving, is like, I have the optimism that we're going to be able to solve it. And then, that causes us to just work together and do it. The other is just like lots of people probably do this, is just, you take a breather, right? You take
Oh,
a breather
Yeah,
day or
Yep.
whatever.
Yeah, come back
Good
tomorrow.
Yeah,
Oh,
good,
hey,
good night's rest.
there's the
Yep.
answer.
Yeah.
Works wonders.
So I don't know if it's not really like I can't answer sort of personally, but yeah, I think for us, it's just for me, fortunate I'm part of like this group of engineers that are able to work well together and help each other out to slog through the Windows API.
Yep. Yeah, there's definitely been like passing of work. Like, hey, can you take a look at this? I'm burnt out on this, trying to figure this puzzle out. And yeah, it's very helpful.
Yeah, another thing too is, and I feel like this was even when we were building Astropad on the Mac originally, the first version of it too, is, looking at it one step at a time and kind of like celebrating the bits that work now. Like there might be tons more functionality to implement, but sharing demos and stuff and videos of the parts that are working or something that was just implemented and kind of celebrating that's been those milestones along the way. Because if you focus too much on the end goal all the time, I mean,
Oh,
eventually
yeah.
we need to get there, but if the whole time you're thinking about the end goal, it's like feels
You're
like
gonna
insurmountable.
stress yourself out.
Yeah, totally. Versus like, oh my God, we got, the network up, or we got the UDPs working, or, whatever it may be. We're capturing from Windows. Woohoo, we're capturing the screen, these little milestones along the way.
Yeah, this reminds me that that's kind of how Rust, like me introducing Rust, actually worked out. Was I presented it as a piecemeal, like, made sure like we do this in a step-by-step way. We don't just like, oh hey, we're rewriting the entire app starting today. It's like, nope, we were writing this piece right now, and then we'll worry about the rest after that. And I think that can be applied to a lot of things, is to try to keep your focus kind of narrow in the short term. Like, all right, this is my current task. Like, we need to get this puzzle piece done, and then it'll fit into the bigger piece, and we'll have more things done after that. That has helped greatly kind of keep things on track.
Yeah, and Matt, when you mentioned the celebrating the little things, it's true. Like I never thought of that, but now reflecting back, it's like you can remember like all those little things that we've did, and it helps drive motivation and kind of gets you excited to like solve the small problem you're working on and share it. And then it's like, yay, we got that working, and then just keeps the machine moving. Whereas I think if we didn't do that, I think these problems, it would feel harder to solve.
Yeah, that's reminding me of early on. Gosh, this would probably be about a year ago now then, where we had a copy of the Windows screen showing up on the iPad.
Oh yeah.
And it was,
That was very
super
exciting.
slow. It was like
Yeah.
crazy slow. And I didn't care at all. I thought it was the greatest thing. I was like, oh my God, look at this. It's the Windows menu on an iPad, It's like, don't try moving the mouse. But
There wasn't a mouse.
There wasn't a mouse. You're right. There wasn't a mouse, but that was still super cool.
Yeah, that was very exciting. Like
Yeah,
to
it's like
it's the I think I've heard of it as like the black triangle moments, like getting something kind of tangible on screen.
Yes. Oh my God, it's working. And the other thing too is I think about with these kinds of problems we're working on, and especially with something like the liquid stack that's got some really low level networking, video compression, all sorts of, and it has to be really fast, 60 frames a second. It's a hard problem. And, sometimes I'm like, yeah, this isn't meant to be easy. If this was easy, tons of companies and tons of apps out there would have similar functionality in them, but they're not. This isn't easy to do. It's just that we're after it day after day after day that we're able to pull this off. We're putting so much concentrated effort in figuring out how to get this to work, to get this really low latency, high performance network code, to get this really low latency, high quality video compression. It's not easy to do. And sometimes it's easy to forget that as well.
And thinking about the complexities of that, sometimes when you go right down to the granular level, there are simple calculations, super simple math. But as you go up the stack and all those things have to work together and you get the emergence of the whole system, it's so complicated.
Yeah, that's something else we talk about, the emergent behavior. It's almost like not fractals, where you have these simple mechanisms. You're like, yeah, as you're saying, Corwin, you're like, I understand this simple piece, I understand how it works, but I put 10 of them together and all of a sudden we're observing this behavior that nobody understands. Like, well, how does this work? Where did this come from?
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of the human body too, like just the flow of the systems and the organs and the blood is just like, somehow it all works.
Yeah. Crazy complex system.
Yeah. Well, we've made amazing progress, and we'll have to do another one of these in the future once we officially ship our 1.0s as well. But we're in a really solid place with running Liquid on Windows. Anything you guys want to add before we?
I thought of one thing kind of near the beginning that we didn't touch on, which is another great thing about Rust is cargo, which is, I think of it as like the dependency system. There's maybe a more accurate way of describing it, but just this week I started to work on a new small testing tool, and it was just like, oh, I need to bring in this third-party library, and it's like a single line of code. And I think back to iOS development, I didn't use a lot of third-party libraries because there was too many choices, and you're not sure what you're getting. But I feel like the whole cargo system and the ecosystem around it for those, they're called crates. I think of them as libraries. They're fairly well documented, and it's just so easy to add dependencies to your code, because chances are someone else has probably done a good job of a specific tool that you need. Yeah, what do you think, Jeremy?
Yeah, that has definitely been a huge help with learning Rust and just using it like, oh, it's like I need to do this, and it's like boom, 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 I can add a bunch of, it's like, oh, I need to deal with JSON. Well, there's a crate for that. It makes it very easy. And this may seem kind of familiar to like some developers because, they may be a Node.js developer and they're used to having that kind of ease. It's nice for, us kind of desktop developers or whatever that had limited options for that, or we didn't, there's some for iOS, but like there's pros and cons, and it's not like part of a tool chain. Where like Rust is kind of like batteries included. This is like, here's the documentation tool, here's the linter, here's the package manager. Like, you got all the base core, command line tools that you typically like to have with a language. And that is super great. And yeah, and I agree with that. There's a lot of good quality crates out there. And, there's even some I know that are like being considered to be part of Rust. So yeah, there's lots of good stuff.
Well, cool. Well, thanks, guys. Thanks for coming on, talking about our port to Windows. And I look forward to, checking out and showing the world what you've been working on.
Yeah, I can't wait for people to play with it.
Yeah, it's going to be good.
It'll be good.
All right. Bye-bye now.
Bye, guys.
Bye.